You are listening to the GodArchy podcast, where we shove a crowbar between state and church. This is the spot where Christian faith intersects with libertarian anarchism and voluntaryism. I'm your host, Mike Meharry. In this episode, I'm going to talk about Christian war-mongering. Greetings to everybody. Thank you so much for tuning into the GodArchy podcast. As always, I do very much appreciate the fact that you've taken some time out of your day to listen to the show. A little bit disappointed today. I was really pumped. I had Scott Horton scheduled to do an interview today on his new book, Enough Already, Time to End the War on Terrorism. And then I saw this morning that Joe Biden had authorized some bomb dropping in Syria. And I thought, man, this is great. I'm going to get to talk to Scott while this is fresh. And unfortunately, Scott had something come up and had to postpone our interview. So unfortunately, no Scott Horton today. And of course, that left me in a lurch because I'm like, okay, what am I going to talk about? I had my episode all planned and laid out for this week. And, there's a lesson for you podcasters out there. It's not a good idea to schedule your interview on the last day that you're planning to produce the podcast. But it is what it is. And Scott has assured me that we'll be able to reschedule sometime over the next several days and should be able to get an interview with him out on the next episode to talk about his fantastic book. But anyway, like I said, Biden authorized airstrikes in Syria. They were against, quote, Iranian-backed militias. So it took, 5 weeks to get bombs from Biden? This goes to what Tom Woods has said, no matter who you vote for, you get John McCain. I said this before Biden was elected during the campaign that everybody was all excited about getting a new president. I said, this is just another warmonger. We're going to end up with the same foreign policy that we had with Trump, that we had with Obama, that we had with Bush. It's true. No matter who you vote for, you end up with John McCain. The wars, the bombs, they continue on and on, no matter who's in office. So this bombing was supposedly in retaliation for rocket attacks on U.S. targets in neighboring Iraq. Now, honestly, I'm skeptical of the whole Iranian-backed militia thing. Like, they're supposed to be the bad guys. I would bet dollars to donuts, and we'll ask Scott about this when I have him on the show. I will bet you almost anything that at some point we were supporting these people that we're now dropping bombs on, because that's the way our foreign policy has been. We support people for a while and then we don't support them. We supported the Shiites in Iraq because we wanted to get rid of Saddam Hussein, and then that backfired. And, it's just this huge mess. And that's one of the things that really stands out in Scott's book. When you read it, this book is really an overview of the quote unquote war on terror. And he actually goes back to the 1970s. And as you read the book, it becomes increasingly clear that each of these engagements, each of these escalations, each of the wars has its roots in what came before it. And we tend to be real short-sighted. We'll look at, these Iranian-backed militias, they were shooting missiles at American positions in Iraq, and we just leave it at that. And nobody ever stops to ask the question, well, why are there Americans in Iraq to begin with? Nobody goes back and looks at the cause and effect. We just look at each individual incident and then cheerlead the war. So, again, we'll get more into the details of the wars in the next episode. I want to really talk more today about the philosophy of war. By and large, the right will support Biden in his bombing. In fact, we'll probably end up getting some version of Biden's not being tough enough. And of course, the left is going to support it because Biden is their guy. And then the average American's just going to shrug because, well, quite frankly, they don't really care about blowing people up thousands of miles away. It's an out of sight, out of mind kind of thing. Sad to say, but true. And, what really enrages me is the Biden supporters. The Biden supporters who want to put him up on this moral pedestal because he's not a poo-poo duty head like Trump was. We finally have somebody who looks presidential. We finally have somebody who's not an embarrassment. He looks good in a suit and he makes nice tweets and he's our guy. And you know what? I'm going to guess that the people who just got blown to shreds by U.S. bombs don't really give a darn that the guy who ordered it is super good on Twitter. But really the saddest thing of all is the number of Christians who full-throatedly support all of America's wars. And, I've said before, that's one of the main reasons that I actually got the GodArchy.org domain name, because I wanted there to be some kind of Christian voice against all of the wars. And there are some out there. Brian Zond, fantastic book, Farewell to Mars. You have a handful of Anabaptists and Mennonites and Quakers who are historically and consistently anti-war. And you'll find people here and there. But by and large, the church supports all of this warmongering. Whether they're kind of lefty-leaning churches or right-wing churches, evangelical, whatever, down the line, they tend to support American foreign policy. America's churches are in bed with America's government. And I'm going to argue today that they're basically in bed with Satan. And I know that sounds harsh, but that is the reality, and I'm going to make that case in this episode. There's a song by a band called The Choir, one of my favorite Christian bands. They started way back in the 80s, and they're actually still making music today. There was a song that they did called The Rifleman that comes to mind often when war drums start pounding. The chorus is, "Whatever happened to the Rifleman?" And Rifleman is referring to a character in a TV show that was popular. I think it was in the 60s, The Rifleman. And he was, he went and got vengeance on the bad guys. So the song lyric is, "Whatever happened to the Rifleman? I've got a job for the Rifleman. He really knows how to settle the score when mercy knocked on the devil's door. When I pray for peace and revel in war." And that so perfectly sums up the attitude of the church by and large. We pray for peace, we talk about peace, but we revel in war. We love it. And I was there. I mean, I make this criticism as a repentant warmonger. I was the guy in the 90s that was sitting in front of the TV every night watching Gulf War I because I thought it was so cool. It's not cool. People are dying. Men and women are losing their lives. Children are being killed. It is a horrible, destructive evil that is being perpetrated on the world. And yet here we are as the church, as followers of the Prince of Peace, cheerleading this garbage. Now, I could go into a multitude of political reasons that the U.S. government shouldn't keep killing people in the Middle East. I can talk about the cost in both lives and treasure. I could explain how past interventions led to new interventions that are going to lead to future interventions in this perpetual cycle of violence. I can explain the concept of blowback and how foreign intervention and occupation actually makes Americans less safe. The mantra is, we got to fight them over there, so we're safer over here. No, it doesn't work that way. But honestly, there are a lot of people who can make those arguments far better than I. Again, it's a shame that I couldn't get Scott on the show today because he really understands all of the details and intricacies of what America's foreign policy has done and wrought. So next episode, that's going to happen. But like I said, today, I want to talk a little bit more about just the philosophy of war and ask the question and challenge you as a believer in Jesus, if you are a believer in Jesus, to challenge you, why are you supporting this? As a Christian, I reject the U.S. warfare state. and all the other warfare states for that matter. And it's for a more fundamental reason than politics and pragmatism. I submit to a king who claims the title Prince of Peace. He rules over a kingdom that promises to beat swords into plowshares and spears into pruning hooks. How can I revel in war? Isaiah 9 offers a glimpse at the coming kingdom and the king who will rule over it. The prophet proclaims, "The people walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of deep darkness, a light has dawned." This implies a new kind of kingdom, right? A kingdom of light, a kingdom where every warrior's boot used in battle and every garment rolled in blood will be destined for burning, will be fuel for the fire. The kingdom of light is a kingdom of peace. Earthly kingdoms founded and maintained by force and violence and militaries, they spin forever in darkness. They exist in the shadow of death. Did not Jesus come to establish something new, something contrary to these kingdoms of the world that all ultimately belong to the devil? That's what I want to drill into today. Now, if you are a reader of the GodArchy website, you're going to recognize some of what I'm going to say because I actually wrote an article about this that I published last week, and I'm pulling a good bit from that. But I'm going to flesh some of this out and actually address a couple of objections that I've gotten from that article. Now, before I get into that, I can hear some of you out there already. Mike, you're being idealistic. You have to live in the real world. We're going to have wars. You can't, peace would be great, but we can never have peace. Did Paul not tell us with Christ all things are possible? Do we believe that as Christians? Or does that just apply, when we're praying for somebody to be healed or to get a new job or something like that? Do we believe or not what Jesus tells us about his kingdom? If the kingdom is a kingdom of peace, aren't we responsible here and now to be pushing and working toward that kingdom and believing that if God has promised this, if Jesus has promised this, that it is possible and that it's up to us to do the work to make that become a reality? So here's where I'm going with this. This is my thesis, if you will. The state is a death cult, and war is its most holy sacrament. And as Christians, we should not participate in any way, shape, or form in this death cult. I'm going to start with theologian William Stringfellow. If you've listened to the show regularly, you've heard me bring Stringfellow up before. In fact, you've heard this very point that I'm about to make on more than one occasion, because quite frankly, it is one of the most profound things that I've read in quite a while. Stringfellow astutely observed that the moral authority of the state is death. The state roots its power in violence, force, and coercion, and ultimately in death. Think about it for a minute. Everything that the state does, it does at gunpoint. It collects taxes at gunpoint. It enforces its laws at gunpoint. Even the things that it does that are quote unquote good are ultimately done at gunpoint. With this understanding, the state's obsession with war should come as no surprise, because the state gets power from it. I want you to listen to this very carefully, what I'm about to say. The state drives humanity to war, and then it feeds on the death and destruction that it brings. It's actually a vicious, nasty, demonic cycle. Let me say it again. The state drives us to war, and then it feeds on the death and destruction that it brings. I'm going to explain how as we move through this podcast. In his book, Conscience and Obedience, Stringfellow describes the fall as, quote, the renunciation of life as a gift and a rejection of the word calling life into being. Quote, the vocation of creation is usurped. In the fall, the reign of death is pervasive and militant. It spares no life whatever. Every relationship is broken or corrupted or diminished to violence. Anti-worship is endemic for institution and nations as much as persons. Time means confinement to the power of death. Instead of possessing dominion over creation, human life is enslaved to and dominated by the rest of creation. In fallen creation, the power of death appears triumphant over the existence of this world. I think that is an amazingly accurate description of the fall. And of course, Jesus overturns that by dying and raising to life. He conquers death, the ultimate expression of the fall. Now, given this fallen world that we live in, it follows that the kingdoms of this world, nation states established in a fallen world, run by fallen people, they are obviously captive to this reign of death. They are part of fallen humanity. The Babylon parable in the book of Revelations ascribes death as the moral reality that rules all nations and all other principalities and powers in this world. I highly recommend go read Revelations 12 and 13. You know, people love to cite Romans 13 in support of civil government. You should always read Romans 13 alongside Revelation 13 because it gives you a very different view of these earthly states and their governments. Okay, back to Stringfellow. He calls the state the preeminent principality. When we're talking about principalities, think Ephesians 6:12. He describes principalities as, quote, the institutions, systems, ideologies, and other political and social powers as militant, aggressive, and influential creatures in the world as it is. I think it's interesting that he ascribes creaturely characteristics to the state and its institutions. You know, basically what he's saying is these entities have a life of their own. They have a personality and an individual essence. And I've actually talked about this a couple of times on the show, I think. I know it sounds weird to talk about a state or a government or an institution as a creature and as having a personality. But, you know, this is something that management experts already understand. They call it corporate culture, but it's getting at the same idea. I remember studying this in business school back, you know, when I was at the University of Kentucky, talking about this idea of corporate culture. And think about it, you know, there's the Disney culture, there's the Chick-fil-A culture, you know, you expect certain things. And when people enter into these institutions, become part of these institutions, they begin to take on aspects of the corporate culture themselves, and they embrace it and they perpetuate it. You know, we see it in the negative sense in police culture, you know, the thin blue line. This is a thing. And all Stringfellow is doing is taking something that, you know, your average sociologist or management professor already knows, and he's putting a spiritual spin on it. And I think that spiritual spin is accurate. He writes, death dominates these creatures, and as the preeminent principality, death dominates all states. So death dominates these creatures, these principalities, and Paul says we're battling not against flesh and blood, but against the principalities. And he says, as the preeminent principality, death dominates all states. And yes, ladies and gentlemen, this includes the United States of America. In return, the state gains and maintains its power and position through its alliance with death. Reading again from Stringfellow, among all the principalities in their legion, species, and diversities, the state has a particular eminence. The state, in this context, names the functional paraphernalia of political authority in a nation, which claims and exercises exclusive practical control of coercive capabilities or violence within a nation. This is exactly what political philosopher and economist Murray Rothbard was saying when he said the state has a monopoly on violence. Stringfellow is just saying this in a more spiritual way. Stringfellow goes on to write, the precedence of the state hierarchy among the principalities is related to the jurisdiction asserted by the state over other institutions and powers within a nation. Practically, it is symbolized by the police power, taxation, licensing, regulation of corporate organizations and activity, the military forces, and the like. You know, Stringfellow doesn't mince words. He ultimately calls these principalities demonic. Now, Stringfellow dovetails with the thinking of theologian David Lipscomb, who I actually talked about, I think, a couple of episodes ago. Lipscomb argued that all earthly governments and the states they rule over exist on a foundation of violence. So he agrees with Stringfellow. He writes, quote, "The civil power is founded on force, lives by it, and is its only weapon of offense and defense. States mimic the pattern of Babylon." Lipscomb notes that the first human government was called Babel. Quote, "It was clearly so called because man's effort to govern himself brought confusion and strife. The effort by man to live without God and to govern the world resulted in confusion and strife from the beginning. It brings strife, war, and desolation still." Okay, so where am I getting this? The Bible doesn't specifically say all this, but this is pretty standard Hebrew theology. Nimrod was widely viewed as the head of the first empire. In Genesis, we're told Nimrod was the son of Cush, grandson of Ham, and great-grandson of Noah. He was described as a, quote, "mighty one in the earth and a mighty hunter before the Lord." We also know from the Genesis account that the beginning of his kingdom were the towns of Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar, which is what we now call Mesopotamia. Although the Bible doesn't specifically say so, the Hebrews widely viewed Nimrod as the guy who organized the construction of the Tower of Babel. There's references to this in the Talmud, and Josephus wrote about it. I'm actually going to read a passage from Josephus because it kind of fleshes out this idea of who Nimrod was and this idea of the beginning of human government. "Now it was Nimrod who excited them to such an affront and contempt of God. He was the grandson of Ham, the son of Noah, a bold man, and of great strength of hand. He persuaded them not to ascribe it to God, as if it were through his means they were happy, but to believe that it was their own courage which procured that happiness. He also gradually changed the government into tyranny, seeing no other way of turning men from the fear of God, but to bring them into constant dependence on his power. He also said he would be revenged on God if he should have a mind to drown the world again, for that he would build a tower too high for the waters to reach, and that he would avenge himself on God for destroying their forefathers. Now the multitude were very ready to follow the determination of Nimrod and to esteem it a piece of cowardice to submit to God, and they built a tower, neither sparing any pains nor being in any degree negligent about the work. And by reason of the multitude of hands employed in it, it grew very high, sooner than anyone could have expected. But the thickness of it was so great, and it was so strongly built that thereby its great height seemed upon the view to be less than it really was. When God saw that they acted so madly, he did not resolve to destroy them utterly, since they were not grown wiser by this destruction of the former sinners. But he caused a tumult among them by producing them diverse languages and causing that, through the multitude of those languages, they should not be able to understand one another. The place wherein they built the tower is now called Babylon, because of the confusion of that language which they readily understood before. For the Hebrews mean by the word Babel, confusion. So I'm not going out on a limb making this assertion that Babylon is the archetype of government. And again, you see this throughout the Bible, where Babylon is used over and over as this archetype for human government. And it's never put in a good light. Lipscomb fleshes this out more in his book on civil government, which I'll link to in the show notes page. Anyway, he argues that Satan ultimately controls human governments. They exist under his dominion, and we catch a glimpse of this when Satan tempts Jesus by offering him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. This is Matthew 4, 8, and 10. Satan can't offer what he doesn't own. Now, some people have pushed back at me a little bit on this, and they said, well, Satan is a liar, so he doesn't really control the kingdoms of the world. He didn't really have them to give to Jesus, that he was just lying. I don't buy that. First off, I think Jesus knows what Satan is and isn't doing. In other words, Jesus can see through the lies. And secondly, if Jesus knew he was lying, then it wouldn't be a temptation to bow down and worship. If Jesus didn't really believe that Satan had this to offer, then he wouldn't be tempted. I really feel like that this temptation narrative shows that Satan does indeed control these kingdoms, that he had them to give to Jesus. And if Jesus had just worshiped Satan, he could have avoided this whole cross, this whole suffering, this whole death. And he could have been a ruler in the sense that most people expected the Messiah to be. After all, the expectation was the Messiah was going to be like David, and he was going to come back and he was going to restore the glory of Israel. That's basically what Satan was offering, and Jesus resisted that temptation, and he followed the path that God had set out for him, and that was the path of obedience, even to death. So, bottom line, Satan is the God at the center of this death cult that is called the state. Randolph Bourne observed that war is the health of the state. He wrote an essay by that title. I will link to that in the show notes page as well. He was making a political statement, Bourne was, but he swerved into a spiritual truth. The state feeds on violence and death and thus maintains and expands its power. Death nourishes the state. And of course, nothing brings about violence and death like war, right? It is the high holy sacrament of Satan's death cult. Lipscomb observes, all the wars and conflicts of earth, all the desolation, ruin, and bloodshed between separated nations or distinct peoples are the fruits of human governments. Now, this may seem like hyperbole, but just stop for a second and think about it. Why would you want to take up arms against people in Syria if the U.S. government didn't tell you that the Syrians or the Iranians were your enemy? Lipscomb contends that we might get into local or perhaps regional conflicts without nation states and human governments, but we wouldn't launch into wholesale warfare against people we don't even know. Quote, the people of Maine and Texas, of England and India could never become enemies or be involved in strife and war, save through the intervention of human government to spread enmity and excite to war. Individuals in contact might, through conflict of interest or personal antipathy, become embittered and engage in war with each other. But distinct nations or peoples could have no strife, save as they should be excited and carried on by these human governments. That is a truth. Now, again, I had somebody that was kind of wanted to argue this point, and they said, well, if it wasn't for the state, we'd still have killing and war because we're fallen people, and that's just sin nature. Yes, absolutely, that's true. But this sin nature is magnified and funneled through the principality of the state. We would still have death and killing, and even as Lipscomb points out, conflict and warfare on a regional basis, but we wouldn't have World War II if it weren't for nation states. Theologian Karl Barth called Satan death incarnate. This is in contrast to Jesus, who is the Word incarnate or life incarnate. The Word, through the Word, everything was created, all life was given. Satan is the opposite of this. He is death incarnate. So given that Satan ultimately controls all earthly kingdoms, their lust for war makes perfect sense, right? And as the governments of these earthly kingdoms stir up our bloodlust and drive us to war, they gain even more power and control in the process. Bourne shows this in his great essay, War is the Health of the State. I'm going to read just a short passage from that. He wrote, the moment war is declared, however, the mass of the people, through some spiritual alchemy, become convinced that they have willed and executed the deed themselves. They then, with the exception of a few malcontents, people like me, proceed to allow themselves to be regimented, coerced, deranged in all the environments of their lives, and turned into a solid manufactory of destruction toward whatever other people may have, in the appointed scheme of things, come within the range of the government's disapprobation. The citizen throws off his contempt and indifference to government, identifies himself with its purposes, revives all his military memories and symbols, and the state once more walks in august presence through the imaginations of men. Patriotism becomes the dominant feeling and produces immediately that intense and hopeless confusion between the relations which the individual bears and should bear toward the society of which he is a part. Ultimately, this entire vicious cycle drives us down a spiraling path toward death, and that is the ultimate goal of the Prince of Death. This is the goal of the devil. The war and the destruction is demonic. So, as I said at the top of the show, followers of the Prince of Peace, we should reject this entire paradigm. As Lipscomb writes, the government of God breaks down divisions among those who accept it and brings peace and complete union to all who submit to its rule. Why then are so many Christians so eager for war? Why do we pray for peace and revel in war? Why are people who claim to worship the Lord of life bowing at the altar of a death cult? Why do they salute the war banners, stand for the war anthem, and cheer in awe for the war machines? Why do they set the men and women who drag us into these cesspools of death, the Joe Bidens, the Donald Trumps, the Kamala Harrises, the Hillary Clintons, the Barack Obamas, the Bill Clintons, the George Bushes, all of these people, they drag us into death and destruction. Why do we place them upon pedestals of honor? They are literally partnering with the Lord of Darkness against the Prince of Life. Lipscomb wrote, whatever tends to wean men and women from this government of God, God's ultimate sovereign control, and to substitute other governments, human governments for it, brings confusion and strife. Sadly, most of us never really see the fruits of our faithlessness to the Prince of Peace and our devotion to the God of war. But if we look carefully, it's hidden. It was more clear in World War II. It was more clear even in Vietnam. But today, the wars just go on and we hardly even notice. But again, it's there. It's hidden in the shadows. We can see it in solemn rows of tombstones on quiet grassy hills. We can see it in the broken bodies and minds of young men and women who are sent out to do these politicians' bidding and come back broken and destroyed. And we can see it in the orphan children, heartbroken widows. These are all the legacy of a death cult that is alive and well. And again, as I've said several times in the show, Christians should have no part of it. Now, I guarantee you, there will be people who will listen to this and they will be angry with me. How dare you to question the wisdom of the American government? America, that's God's nation, and we're doing what is just and right. That is a bunch of BS. And it is amazing to me how Christians will twist themselves into pretzels to try to justify war and violence. It is not justified. And no, appealing to the Old Testament, yes, I do know that God told the Hebrews to make war on people to take the land. There was a reason for that. I'm not going to get into all of that theology because I'm at the end of the show. But I've talked about this before. I'll try to link to some things in the show notes page. We live under a new covenant. We live under the rule of Jesus Christ. We are moving toward the kingdom of God, where the lamb lies down with the lion, where we beat our swords into plowshares. That's what we're moving toward. Quit trying to justify war, violence, and death, and just say, hey, no, you don't have to support this. There's no reason to do it. It is demonic. You are getting in bed with the devil. You're ultimately worshiping at the altar of a death cult. So that is my, mini sermon for today. So next week, hopefully, we'll have Scott Horton on and we'll talk about his book and we'll get into some of the practical stuff. If you're not a Christian and you're listening to me and thinking this dude's nuts, there are pragmatic reasons that we shouldn't be involved in these foreign interventions. And I don't think you have to be a Christian to recognize that, partnering with the death cult is not a good thing. So we'll talk about that when we get Scott on. But with that, I'm going to close out this show. I do appreciate you listening. If you want to support the work of GodArchy, you can do that. Go to don't go to GodArchy. Well, do go to GodArchy.org because there's a lot of good stuff over there. But go to patreon.com/GodArchy and you can check out our supporting listeners page. $5 a month can support the work that I'm doing. And what we do is we pass 40% of that on to other organizations, other entities, individuals who are in need of help. Over the last couple of months, we've given some money to a pastor up in South Carolina who's doing some really good work just to support what he's doing. And we've also given a donation to the Mises Institute. I've supported antiwar.com, the United Methodist Committee on Relief, which does disaster relief. We've given some money to our good friend J.J. Reichert, who is a musician who was really hurt by the pandemic. So the idea is create community, support each other, put these ideas of voluntaryism into action. And that's kind of the idea behind the supporting listeners group. So again, you can check that out, patreon.com/GodArchy. Again, please do follow what's going on at the website, GodArchy.org. I'm trying to write a little bit more, at least write an article in between episodes. And I'm actually toying with the idea of upping the number of episodes that I'm doing. Probably not for a couple of months, but maybe when we get into summer and things slow down at the 10th Amendment Center, I may do that, which is ironic because, last month I was thinking about stopping the podcast altogether, but I just feel like this work is important and it just keeps driving me along. So something I'm contemplating. More support would certainly help make that decision, to be honest with you. I mean, there is a time commitment and, I have to balance family and other work and whatnot. So anyway, that's something I'm thinking about. But anyway, enough of that. Thank you so much for listening to the show, and I'll talk to you next time again. Hopefully we'll have Scott Horton next week. I also have an interview tentatively scheduled with Carol Ann Harlos, who is I believe the secretary of the Libertarian Party and who is a believer. Wanted to talk to her a little bit about libertarianism and Christianity and what's going on over at the LP. And got a couple other ideas brewing in my head for episodes as well. So thanks so much. Peace.
Oh, you ready for excuse me. You have been listening to the GodArchy podcast in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit with Mike Maharry. GodArchy is an oh my goodness production. You can find us on the World Wide Web at GodArchy.org, on the Facebook at GodArchy.org, and on the Twitter at GodArchy. If you want to get in touch, email us at info@godarchy.org, but no stupid questions, please. And you can support the show at patreon.com. Get in that pocketbook and get some money out. This ain't cheap to do. Thank you for listening. Thank you. And God bless you all in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Ain't gonna